This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. Today I'm delighted to have Peter Huessy back with us. He's going to talk to us about energy for our everyday needs. He's going to describe what the relationship is between our energy sources and climate change. Peter has had an amazing professional experience in the energy business that informs his views. Please tell us about it.
Thank you, Sandra, for inviting me. I first worked as an intern. I was 23 years old, and I worked with the United Nations Environment Program. And we did a report on, were there alternatives to imported oil because of the oil embargo? Third world countries are going broke. Oil went from $2 a barrel to $5 a barrel, and a lot of countries just couldn't afford it. And they said, is there an environmental way to have alternative energy other than oil? And there are only 3 of us in the Office of Energy and Environment at the UN Environment Program. And we did the report. And I was an intern. I had a gentleman from India and a gentleman from Pakistan. And we said the alternatives are oil, gas, coal, nuclear power, hydro, geothermal, wind, and solar. And for the next 100 years, that's what you're going to have to rely on. And renewables that you consider clean are not going to be more than about 20% of your energy. Needless to say, the Economic and Social Council at the UN rejected our report 182 to 7. Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, England all said they loved it, but everybody else said no, they didn't like it, because we couldn't tell them that your dreams can't be fulfilled. You can't have totally clean energy and not have fossil fuels.
How can they vote on this?
Yes, and I still have that report.
Also, you worked in the Department of the Interior.
When I went to the Department of the Interior, one of my jobs was to a brand new agency called the Office of Surface Mining. For the first time, we regulated all coal mining and all surface mining in the country. And this was copper, zinc, lead. And sometimes you see pictures of these open mines that look kind of ugly. And there wasn't any standard as to how to fix them environmentally. And so I did that, but my other job was a special assistant to the Secretary of the Interior for international energy policy. And remember, we had the oil embargo, plus then we had another embargo in '79, and oil prices dramatically increased. The United States went into another recession, and everything we proposed to produce more energy was shot down by the White House. So we had the president say at the time, we're going to run out of natural gas in 1990, which wasn't too far away, 10 years. And therefore, everybody in the industry in Wall Street stopped investing in natural gas. And so we imported oil for electricity and home heating, which is, as you know, New England, very dependent on it. It's a terrible way to use oil. Oil is petroleum. You can make petrochemicals, jet fuel, kerosene, petrochemicals, plastics, fibers, nylon, stock, everything. And when you don't do that, which is a very high-end use for oil, when you just use it to burn in a boiler, the total waste. But that's what we started doing. And that's why when the oil prices went up overseas, America took it took it bad.
We stopped using natural gas.
Well, we stopped investing in new natural gas, and it was considered, well, we're going to run out of it, why are we investing? Turned out to be a total fairy tale. Because fracking came in the 80s, and we have more natural gas now than, I think we're 1, 2, or 3 in the world, depending on how you estimate it. So energy has always been critical to national security policy, which is what I deal with. And God was in a particularly humorous mood when he decided to put all the hydrocarbons that are conventional in the world, 75% of them in the Middle East, and then put the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims all in the same place too.
Jeepers. Jeepers.
So now you understand why that is such a critical part of the world. And sure, I'd love to unhook from oil and gas.
Yes.
But you can't.
75% are in the Middle East.
Conventional.
Conventional.
Fracking is not conventional. Okay. Fracking is responsible for 70% of all the gas and oil the United States uses, without which we would be totally dependent on imported oil. And it's like putting a collar around you and a chain and every time they want something, they'll jerk it, which is what a 2 million barrel cut, which is out of 100 million barrels, 100 million barrels a year, 2 million barrels isn't that much, but by cutting it, OPEC lowered its quota. It had a major impact on our economy because we're 4 million barrels a day lower than where we should be. ANWR was cut, Keystone Pipeline was cut, and we're at basically 11 million barrels a day versus the peak of 13 million, which we were in 2019.
And home population is increasing.
Population is increasing, demand because we're out of the pandemic has increased. So it's unfortunate that we put ourselves in a position. The whole point of producing more was to be independent of OPEC and the other oil producers, because they're all government owned, is that we would not have our economy at risk because of that.
So we'd be able to act as an independent state.
Yes.
I understand you studied how energy and oil and the Middle East impact both the United States economy and our security.
Yes.
I guess you've kind of answered that question just now.
Well, as one of your questions was we were talking about, if you go back, a guy named Zubrin, who was a big space guy, big astronaut, wrote a piece in National Review in the Wall Street Journal in 1975. And then he updated it as you go along. Every major recession since 1975, 1979, 80, 81, and then at the end of the Bush administration was basically 91, okay? Then at the end of the 2000s, the first 1990s under Clinton, around 2000 we had a mild recession, but a recession nonetheless, and then the big one in 2008, all related to spikes in oil prices. In 73, the price of oil went up 300%. In 1979, it went up 200%. In 2008, when we had the big turn down plus the housing crash, oil prices went up 400%. And when they spike like that, because you got to have oil, I mean, and then you have a huge impact on the United States economy, and you're talking about trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of lost GDP, lost jobs, increased costs, and what it does to the stock market, what it does to people's businesses, what it does to our standard of living, particularly if you're on a fixed income and you see inflation going up 8-10%, it's like taking 10% out of your pocket, plus what it does to the market.
So you really need to make sure that you are energy independent.
Well, you don't have to be totally independent. We import oil from Mexico all the time because they don't have refineries. So we import it, we refine it here and send it back. And then we keep some of it. We do the same because we keep cutting refineries down because we make environmental rules so onerous, it's not affordable to own a refinery in America. But refineries are very delicate operations because you have to guess a year in advance that how much kerosene do I need to produce jet fuel, how much diesel, how much gasoline. And the gasoline for California is not the same as Maryland, not the same as Vermont, not the same as Florida, because all the states add rules to what EPA does for oil that's called boutique fuels for themselves. So you got to find the right refinery that will take your request to refine oil that you can use, and then you got to find a truck or a pipeline and get it to you. So this is not a simple deal as refined gasoline is just refined gasoline. No, it isn't. It is all different. Plus you have regular, medium, and high test. So the role of the industry is to get it to us. One of the questions you're going to think about, 90% of the oil in the world is owned by governments, and they decide what to produce. I don't care whether that's Mexico, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Russia or China. They're all owned by countries, and we don't do that. Our oil, except for about 25% of what we have is on federal land, and the federales can cut it back, or they can not give permits. So that's about 25% of our oil and gas is on federal land.
What fuel sources do we use for transportation?
It's a good question. Transportation is almost wholly oil, petroleum, and diesel. Diesel is very big. All your trucks, all your buses, and trucks are the most ubiquitous way to move stuff around the country. And probably trains, because trains get it to a hub and then they offload it on trucks, and then they bring it to the stores or the homes or whatever. So those are huge. Now, There are some people who have used methanol, which is from natural gas, or coal. You have some buses are made from natural gas, but it's in the very, very small margin. We are primarily crude oil of some kind is refined, and that's about 25% of all the greenhouse gases produced are from transportation.
Can we move markedly to electricity?
Okay, very good question.
What are the goalposts?
Okay. When you take a hybrid car, which is partly gasoline and partly electricity, it's actually better than the all-electric, because to produce an electric car versus producing an oil-consuming car, it's twice as bad for the environment in terms of the greenhouse gases you produce when you produce the car. And that is because the metals used in the battery are nickel, cadmium stuff, which requires very, very environmentally insulting mining. And unfortunately, about 80% of everything of these kinds is made in China. And their environmental laws are weak to non-existent. So you have a very serious problem, and you have to drive, depending on how good your car is, you have to drive 30, 70,000 or 120,000 miles on the electric car to break even. Now, the other problem is, when you get electricity, it's not quote unquote clean. 70% of it is fossil fuels.
Oh,
it's natural gas and oil and coal. Now, some of it's nuclear, some is geothermal, some wind, some solar, some hydro. But hydro is 24/7, unless you have the problem you have out west, which is a drought, which they're having worries that the turbines aren't even going to be turning on the rivers in order to generate the electricity to provide Los Angeles and the farmers and so forth. So you got that problem when there's a drought. But let's assume we don't. Solar and wind don't, the wind doesn't wind all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. So if you don't, you got to have a backup. And we don't yet know how to put all this stuff in batteries in Los Angeles or California where the sun is shining is really great. How do you get that solar energy to Illinois? You can't. Okay, we don't have a national grid. And to give an example, if you wanted 50% of the cars in America to be electric vehicles, we're around 12 million right now, something like that. You're talking about 160 million cars. The cost would be $3.7 trillion that we'd have to subsidize those cars, because purchasing a $65,000 car is out of reach of most Americans. I mean, you can't afford the payment, okay? And you can't put a huge down payment in order to make the payments less. So if you want to produce all those, first of all, if you're going to manufacture the cars, who are you going to sell them to? Right now we have a tax credit, but you'd have to have basically a 30,000 plus credit per car. And that's plus the production costs of all the plug-in stations and so forth.
Which don't exist.
Which are easily done. In my community, they just put them right in the sidewalk.
I see.
So a car parks there, parallel parking at night on the townhouse, and all you do is plug it in. That can be done. The problem is California is saying, don't plug your car in at night for your hybrid or your electric car because it's causing blackouts. Well, if you're not going to plug it in during the night, you can't plug it in during the day if you're going to take it to work. So then you're going to have the garage you park in or wherever it is around work, they're going to have plug-in stations, which will have the same problem in California. Is California so reduced their electrical production is they're having brownouts and blackouts because they have too much demand. So electric vehicles sound great. There are some serious problems with them. Their maintenance is great. You don't have a maintenance problem. And once you get the car built, you can, if you're 30,000, 60,000 miles, you can break even and then you're better. But it depends on the car you're replacing and depends on the car you're getting.
Depends on the car you're getting.
Well, it depends on what's the fuel efficiency, how big is the car.
And I know they're starting to replace the high efficiency batteries with lower efficiency batteries.
Yes, the other thing is that I know Tesla has built electric vehicle trucks, which would be great. But if you see now, you don't smell that diesel fuel anymore. And you don't see the plumes of, usually, because the EPA has so reduced the emissions from this. Okay, so for the country as a whole, we were producing 6 billion tons of greenhouse gases in 1990. We're producing 5.
Significant.
So we've cut a billion. However, China was producing 3 billion, now it's 13. And India was 1 billion, and now they're 3.5.
And they have India has a fertility rate.
And India and China together, I was looking at the numbers, America has 227 coal-fired plants. China is building 200 right now.
They are building 200 coal
Building
power.
in addition to the 650 they have, they're building 200 more, each of 1,000 watts on average. So they're building 196,000 megawatts of coal-producing plants in China alone in the next 10 years, which will produce 2 billion tons of carbon, of greenhouse gases. So their 13 billion is going to go up to 15 billion. And that doesn't count the oil. Their oil demand is meant to peak around 2035. I'm not sure what that's based on, given the fact that they have cars like, if they have the cars like we have, they'll quadruple gasoline consumption. I did numbers on that some years ago. I said, what happens if 1.3 billion people have cars at the same ratio as America? Okay, so what I'm saying is the increase in greenhouse gases canceled out in India, canceled out everything Europe's done, and China, just the next 10 years, canceled out, just in coal, canceled out everything the U.S. accomplished. So why should we be smacked around and said, don't use this, and the price is going to go skyrocketing, yet the overall world level of greenhouse gases is not going down, it's going up.
Do you have winds which carry gases all over the world?
Yeah, you can't, our acid rain we had, which was really worrisome, was ending up in Europe. And they did, watching their beautiful fir trees being killed. So we figured out what to do. We limed the lakes in the Adirondacks all over the east where coal was plentiful, and it stopped killing the trees.
Oh, interesting.
And everybody thought it was, we had to stop using coal, or we had to put scrubbers on, or whatever, but it was a kind of a look what we found type thing, solution. But as someone who ran an agency that regulated all the coal mining in America, I was very intimately involved in coal is the livelihood of millions of Americans, both energy they get and energy they produce. And so it was incumbent upon us to see that we could do this cleanly. And I know there are people who think it's a medieval fuel, we ought to get rid of it. Understood. But on the other hand, it is 20% of our fuel. Natural gas is about 40. Nuclear power is 20, and the remainder is hydro, geothermal, solar, and wind.
What kinds of investments would need to be put into place?
Let me give you some numbers. I don't want your audience to be buried in numbers, but Germany, for example, has invested $500 billion, $500 billion since 2000 on clean energy. The percent of the energy they use in the country that in oil has gone from 87% to 79%. Oil, gas, and coal. So fossil fuels have gone down from 89 to 79% with a $500 billion investment. Now, if you look at the Green New Deal bill in Congress, some of which has been passed, the tab I saw was $100 trillion over the next 70 years. To the year 2100, we have to spend $100 trillion. That comes out to about $1.2 trillion a year.
What's $100
That's everything. That's promoting electric cars. That's battery technology. That's solar plants all over the place, wind farms all over the place. But here's some issues. Wind farms are great, except for they kill millions of birds. And millions of birds being killed means billions of insects don't get eaten. Billions of insects on the land eat a lot of corn and grain and food, which you either have to use more pesticides and insecticides to kill, or your crop yields go down. That's just nature. You can't get away from it. I mean, you kill that number of birds, and particularly your windmills are in farming areas.
That's right.
Okay? So what you gain on the wind side, you get lost on the insecticide and pesticide problem. And if you don't use insecticides and pesticides, food prices go up because your food production goes down. And that's not just here, because we are such a huge exporter of food, as well as a big importer, but we end up causing food prices to go up in countries for grain that can't afford it. And that's not good. So while windmills are great, they have a very big downside because they're so huge, they just kill an enormous amount of birds. That's your problem, one problem. Plus, we don't know yet how to store it enough. So you need a backup anyway. What do you back up? But the only other renewables are hydro and geothermal. And hydro is based on where's the river and where's the lake. And you can't dam up every lake in America or every river and flood everybody. Number one. Number two, geothermal is like Yellowstone. That's a geothermal, but it's only limited by, there's a lot in Idaho, there's a lot in Utah, but you just can't, it's not a question of drilling and finding, there's a geothermal thing I can use. And then people have talked about tidal power. They put these gizmos out in the ocean, and as the tide comes in and out, it moves the turbines. Well, that's true, but the tide doesn't come in and out except for in big intervals. So as I said, physics has a lot to do with this. And physics says one of the miracles of oil and gas is it's portable. You can use it anywhere. It doesn't need to be, you can sit in a tank, it's fine, okay? And it has thousands of uses, from plastics to synthetics to diesel fuel and it has caused a increase in life expectancy from 30 years to 75 worldwide. It has caused billions of people to get out of poverty. It has increased people's per capita income 50-fold. I mean, you go back in 1830, 1840, 1850, go back anytime. The increase has been extraordinary. Plus, the electricity has enabled us to have sanitation that we never had before, which has dramatically reduced infant mortality. So, in my mind, the age of oil is synonymous with the Industrial Revolution, which is synonymous with modernity and economic growth. Now, we can give it all up. We can say we don't want anymore, but you're talking about, you're going to have riots on your hand, to say it, put it mildly, okay? And if there was a simple alternative, everybody in the world would say, yeah, sure, let's do it. What's the problem? But there isn't, and that's what the fight is about.
What would you like the public to take away with them?
Well, I think they have to know that the intergovernmental panel that the UN puts together every year, I read the 634-page report from 2017 to 2021. And it had, as the UN does, about 620 pages of gobbledygook. And yet you can't find anywhere in there, what does it need to take for us not to increase temperatures by the dreaded 2 degrees centigrade? From 2 to 4 degrees. That's a no-no. That's going to kill. That's going to flood everybody, and it's going to cause more hurricanes and so forth. Hurricanes now in the United States are far less than they used to be. Really? And tornadoes. They cause more damage. Why? Because we have more population, more buildings in the area, and the cost of everything is up. So of course the dollar value, but the actual number of hurricanes. Notice this hurricane season, we had one bad one in Florida.
That's right. Usually we have 3.
Exactly, and so they're way down. So the idea that any change in climate that you don't like is somehow, the oil boys are doing it, is if people come out with one thing. But the key point is, I told you, even if you think this is a serious problem, and liars, okay, you can't get there to where you want to go from here in 2035 or 2050 or 2070. There is not the alternative energy. And the alternative is to starve yourself of energy, like I talked about Africa. They're not going to go quietly into the night and say, oh yeah, we'll live with, the United States uses 800 kilos of coal equivalent per person per year. Okay? They're not going to get along and say, okay, we'll use this 40.
And that's
1/20th.
Is that the proposal?
Well, that's what you'd have to do in order to reduce gas and oil consumption and coal consumption to the extent that you need to meet the objectives. But I don't know that reducing greenhouse gases. We're at 50 billion a year. I see nothing in the IPCC report that says, well, if you reduce to 30, the temperature won't go up. Because if you look at the numbers, that 50 is going to become 80 in 20 years. And if the United States cuts out everything we do in greenhouse gases, 5 billion tons, 80 will be 75. And it'll still be way, way above the objective. And so what do we do this for? To me, I mean, as someone who takes this seriously and has been working on it since the 70s, this is, it's 50 years, the numbers don't lie. The thing is, you would never see the media say, if you reduce greenhouse gases from 5 billion to 1 billion tons, which would be huge, the temperature, instead of being 2 degrees, will be 1.5. But when you do the numbers for the United States, we do everything the greenhouse, green revolution, clean power does, will reduce the temperature by 1/2 of 1%, not 1/2 of 1 degree. 1/2 of 1%. What's 1% of 2 degrees? And then what's 1/2 of that? Nobody will notice. It's not measurable. I mean, assuming that we're measuring things correctly, we don't measure any temperature gauge. There's not a single temperature gauge on the ocean. There's 2 in Russia, both at airports, which tend to be hotter. And a lot of them are in urban areas, which are hotter. So I won't go into the thing about, some people think a lot of it is bogus, and it's designed to sell carbon credits and things like that. But let's say it's real. You can't get there, in your current plans, don't get you to where you want to go.
Peter, I want to thank you so much for
Thank
coming
you,
on
Sandra.
the show.
Thank you.
This is Speak Up. This is Sandra Schulte. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.